Hello there, this is Dhiru Munuluru and welcome back. Let's now get started with Git and let's get a high-level understanding of how Git works. So we are going to look at the benefit of a distributed version control system, and we will briefly look at what Git stages are and what Git branching is and a little bit about GitHub. Okay, so it's going to be a high-level introduction to Git, but first things first, we need to know who invented Git. Git was invented by Linus Torvalds, and we all know who he is. He's the one who invented the Linux kernel. So we need to know the person who invented the tool that we are using. Now here, this is the illustration from one of the previous lectures. So it's a distributed virtual control system, and we know that Git is an example of this. Now the key thing here is on every developer's machine, there is a working copy and also a local Git repository. So what it means is the developer can maintain multiple versions of his or her code right there on his or her machine. So the entire history of code changes are right there on the same local machine. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the developer can work completely offline. So if there is no internet connection, then you can still work on your local copy, make your changes and commit those changes to the local repository. And when you get access to the internet, you can push your changes from the local repository into the remote repository. So if you are on a vacation in some hills up there, and if you have limited internet connection, and if you have a wonderful boss who expects you to work during vacation, then you can still make your changes and you can make your series of commits into the local repository. And when you regain access to internet, then you can sync those changes with the remote centralized repository, right? So that's one of the benefits of using a distributed version control system. And if you are an individual developer, you really do not even need a remote repository. You can just work with the local Git repository, keep making your changes, all your commits, so you're creating different versions of your software. And when the time arises, when you have another developer or more than one developer, then you can create a remote centralized repository so that all of them can also contribute to the same project. Now that's the typical use case in any company. But even if you are an individual developer, it is better you use a remote repository like GitHub, and that way your code is secure. So if you have any system crashes, then you know that you do not have to worry because all your code is secure in the cloud. So all you need to do is just clone that repository and you're good to go. Okay? So that's the main benefit of using a distributed VCS. Now let's briefly look at Git states. So this is a single machine and we know that there is a working copy and there is the local Git repository. So you can think of them as two different areas. And there is also an intermediate area called as staging. And it is also referred to as an index. So that's the technical Git terminology. It's called as an index. And the files that you really want to commit is what will be there in the staging area. So essentially in the working directory or the working copy, you would be making your changes, and so you will have one or more files which have been modified. So we say that the code is in modified state. And you would want to add those files into the staging area. It may be all of those files or it may be a subset of the modified files. Sometimes some of the files may not be useful for other developers. So in which case you would want to add only the ones that would be useful. So what you would do is you would add those files which you want to commit into the staging area, and we say that those files are in staged state. So initially we had the modified state and now the staged state. And you would use the command git add. So if you are using a git command line utility, so you would execute this command and that would add into the staging area. But typically you will be using some sort of a user interface like an IDE like Eclipse, in which case it would be a simple button click, and behind the scenes this particular command would be executed. So the next step would be to commit these changes into the local repository. So right now the files have been marked to be pushed to the local repository. So that marking has been done, and the next step would be to commit it to the local Git repository. And we say that the files are in committed state now, and with that you have a new version of your source code. And you would use this command git commit if you are using a command line utility. And along with that you would also give a commit message, and it is recommended to use a good meaningful commit message so that you and everyone else will know what this commit is about. All right, so that's what you would do. But in Eclipse, once again, it's a simple button click. So these are the different states that we have in Git, and very soon we are going to look at all of this in action. So we make our commits during the course of a day or the week. Let's say we made a single commit on Monday, and you would also make similar commits on Tuesday, Wednesday, during the rest of the week. Let's say at the end of the day you make your commit. Now all of these sequence of commits are said to be part of something called as a branch. Okay. Branch is essentially a sequence of commits, and the default branch in Git is called as main branch, and typically it would include the production code, the code that would go on to the production servers. So that's the typical use case, but sometimes you would also want to create more than one branch for different reasons. So one reason can be that, let's say you want to implement some new features and you want to experiment that. So you would create a new branch for that, and you would make your changes and you would commit your changes. So this is a completely new branch, and it is independent of the main branch. So C6 would be the next commit after C5, but that's in the new experimental branch that you have just created. And simultaneously you can also continue working on the main branch. Okay, so these two branches are completely independent. So they are just like the branches in a tree. And once you are sure that your experimental features are really good and they're passing all your tests, then you can merge that branch into the main branch. So the commits that you have done, like C6 in this case, will be merged with the main branch, and those hot new features that you have created can go into the next release of your software. So that's Git branching and merging, and this Git branching is considered as a killer feature in Git because it is implemented very efficiently. In other VCS, it is an expensive process, but in Git, it is implemented in a very efficient way. So that's Git branching, and there is much more to it, but right now I think we just need to understand what it is, what the concept is about, and I think that's a nice high-level idea of Git branching. Next is GitHub, and GitHub is simply an online portal for hosting Git repositories. So your local Git repository will be hosted on GitHub, github.com. That way, all of the other developers in your team can clone that repository and can start contributing to it. So that's GitHub, and GitHub is owned by Microsoft, and all of the tech giants like Google, Amazon, Apple, and almost everyone else also use GitHub for their projects. So all of those large open source projects which involves developers across the world do use GitHub, and they clone those repositories and make their valuable contributions. So that's Git and a little bit about GitHub and how Git works, and I hope you liked listening to that. Thank you and see you soon.